I'll tell you up front, the easy way to add drama to your drawings, to really give them some punch, to make them the sort of drawings that people can't help but look at and get drawn into and give attention to. And then I'll show you how this can look in different ways with different subjects. The thing that particularly beginners so often underestimate is the importance of contrast in our drawings. And I think that's because we're so focused on getting accuracy of shape, of form, of perspective. But those things can be 100% correct and still leave scenes, drawings that look underwhelming, even a bit boring. At the end, I'll show you a few of my drawings where I think I didn't get the contrast right in comparison to these ones where I think I did. Now, contrast is simply a difference between two things. The most obvious contrast here is between the dark inked areas and the white paper. Particularly when we have strong light, sunny day scenes, we want to get a really bold contrast between our darkest areas and our lightest areas. And one of the most important ways to create value contrast, and by values we simply mean light and dark, is to make sure we leave a lot of white paper, that we put no marks on. Sometimes the value has come from shade and shadow. Other times it comes from the color of the object itself. As the artist, it's up to us to see the opportunities in the scene we have to create contrast and to take advantage of them. Lots of strong contrast, going really dark with the darkest darks and going quite dark with darker darks. But contrast is not just with value, with lights and darks, it's also with our line direction. Foliage gives us wonderful opportunity to have line directions in virtually any direction that we want, that will create contrast that we want. But we also get strong contrast between architecture and foliage. Architecture creates the need for a lot less variety of line and line direction, a lot more regularity of shape and form. So we can combine the contrast between our line direction and the length of our lines to really bring out the difference, the contrast between the various forms, the marks that we've used, the directions the marks going, and how many marks we put in one spot. We see something similar to this here, where I've exploited, emphasized even, the difference between the dark values and colors of the trees behind and this pavilion. I've drawn this stonework with a lighter feel than much of what I've done, so as not to detract from the lovely contrast, I think, between these columns and the darkness behind. Something similarly is happening here. The architecture kept simple, very strong contrast in adjoining areas of lights and darks, and a great contrast in the marks I've used and the directions of the marks. We don't have to have lots of very dark darks to exploit the idea of contrast, to strengthen visually how our drawings look, and also to help us understand what we're seeing. In this, we have the contrast between these strong directional lines following the perspective, the roof lines, the veranda lines, the weatherboard lines, the railing lines. As a contrast to these, we have this tangle of lines and darker values of the plants that we have in this closest yard. And even within these plants, I've tried to provide some contrast of line and shapes to indicate that they're different plants. But going darker here, closest to us, helps to make this feel closer, but it also helps to separate the foliage from the architecture. It's not just the shapes we've drawn, it's how close the lines are, how dark the effects we create, what directions the lines are, how they overlap, and also being controlled in some of the other elements so that we preserve quite a lot of paper that provides a contrast of white against the more inked areas. This also works in more simplified subjects. With this Australian galah, a small parrot, we have the contrast between the feather lines coming down this way and the hatching lines curving around the body, basically at 90 degrees to the feather lines. We have a nice strong contrast with these hatching lines that provide an almost black value against the white, really grabs the eye, brings us here. And then we have the contrast between the hatching on the bird, which basically sweep around in this direction, and the hatching I've used for the grass, which is very upright, which both emphasizes the form of the grass, but also visually provides a contrast between the grass and the bird of line direction, and therefore helps us not to lose the bird in the grass. And in a scene of complex subjects, controlling contrast, providing lots of open space, if you like, lots of white value, is important to help us access what we're looking at, rather than simply bounce back from a tangle, a mass of lines. It's partly taking advantage of inherent contrast in our subjects, but also exploiting and emphasizing them. Darker values with lighter values. Just before I made this video, I darkened some of the darks just a little bit more. And this really helped to create the depth of plane from foreground to the far distance. This house view could have been a tangle of lines. I almost didn't draw it because I thought it's just going to be a mess. But then I worked out I could adapt the reference in a way that I created these layers, in effect, of light and dark, that create separation, visual separation, so that we can work out what we're looking at. And by, again, changing the direction and the way I put the marks on the paper, as well as the values I created by the number of marks I put in the one place, we don't just get clarity of what we're looking at, but it becomes far more interesting. But we can use contrast with a lighter touch and still visually get very impacting results. Strong contrast here between the vertical lines of this ruined abbey and the hatching direction of this shaded area of vertical and horizontal. There's also the strong contrast of the stonework that is hatched and the stonework which has very little ink on it to create the effect of sunshine in contrast to the shaded area. And the contrasts don't have to be right up hard against each other to still create a very important effect. The much lighter value that I've created in how I've drawn this furthest end of the street is very important in giving interest and movement to what we see. I need to be thinking of the contrast that I want to create before I start to draw. And of course, I can create contrast not just with hatching. In fact, it's much easier and faster to create strong value contrasts using ink washes. The really important part here was these high contrast areas where sunlight was still reaching these columns, but equally to get dark contrasts next to them, adjacent to them. And that can be on a smaller, more casual scale. I remember when I drew this, I kept going darker with these pews in the front. But as I took these darker, I was able to go darker here and here and here, maintaining the relative values between them and still create the sense of distance moving back. And that then created greater contrast between these areas and these furthest, better lit areas of the cathedral. We need boldness to experiment with going darker than perhaps we normally have. It can be good to come back to it a bit later and think, how can I make this just a little bit darker, make it pop a little bit more? This is probably my most high contrasted drawing. It's not just that I've gone really dark with my darks, but I've also worked hard at line direction, contrast in the direction my hatching for the various elements of the composition to help bring clarity as well. I have a predominantly vertical line down here where it's very dark, but I also have a predominantly horizontal line on the pathway on the roadway. I have a very strong contrast between this darkly shadowed area in front and the sunlit area of foliage behind, where I've underdrawn it to emphasize the contrast and to help bring clarity to what could be a tangled visual scene otherwise. The lines further back of the plants and grasses are more vertical than these ones, which still curve somewhat. And the very dark foliage of this overhanging tree sweep in this direction, again, to bring differentiation between what's happening here and what's happening elsewhere. And together, they create a strong sense of movement, which most of the time is an advantage in a drawing, and a strong sense of drama. We have these darkest areas right next to the lightest areas, darkest areas right next to the lightest areas. A similar scene drawn with a finer pen, very strong contrast between our darks and our lights. And sometimes we need the time commitment to go dark with our darks in this sort of scene. We also need control not to put too many marks in our light spaces. Again, we have line direction, fundamentally horizontal hatching down here on the ground, sloped hatching here, where our ground is sloping upwards, curved hatching that's approximately vertical, where we have grasses growing up, horizontal hatching on the trunk of the tree that contrasts the vertical nature of the tree but reflects the circular underlying form. And again, we have this layering of lights and darks. We have dark, we have light, we have darker, but lighter and darker and lighter and darker, to create a scene with, I think, a great deal of visual drama, despite its inherent simplicity. There is a lot less value here, but I've still used the contrast of my line direction to bring clarity. We have an emphasis of horizontal lines for the ground and the things on it, and the vertical lines of the trees and the shrubs. If you look at a range of my drawings, even when the overall values are lighter, again, there's this layering of darker, lighter, darker, lighter. And of course, the values come from the spaces between things as well. So how does it look when we don't inject this same degree of contrast into our drawing? Well, it can mean that it's harder to see what's happening. Compare this tree and the sense of 3 dimensions that we get with it with this tree, where while there are some parts that are darker than others, there's really too many marks all in the same directions or the same types of marks creating the same mid-value. It's a flatter tree. Here, without intending to, the overall effect at the end was a lot of mid-value. The values I've created with the shadow under the veranda, with the shade on the end wall, and with the effect of the rusted corrugated iron and of this tree, this shrub, is all too much the same. There's very little tonal contrast. Creates a drawing that's just not as interesting. Compare the effect of this with this, where there are a lot more value contrast of dark and light, and a lot more variation of line direction. This drawing was for a video of tangles of bare branches, but I think I got a bit tangled up myself in it. And in this top half of the drawing, it's really just too hard, particularly in the center, to work out what's happening. Again, without intending to, I've created a large mid-value area. More successful down here with my layering of contrast areas. Here we have another house with too much mid-value, too much the same darkness everywhere, with the exception of above the roofline, which ends up visually being the most interesting part of the drawing for that reason. And here's a large tree where, again, I got tangled up too much in too much mid-value, making it hard to even know in parts what's what. It was doing drawings that turned out looking like this that made me realize how much planning and focus I needed to have before I started to put lines that I wouldn't be able to erase on my drawing, that then gave me the self-control to maintain more white on the paper and to create stronger contrasts that separated out the various elements and the various depths of plane and created depth and movement, and a drawing that we could enter into and move around, understanding what we were looking at. Contrast of values, of lights and darks, of line direction, layers of light and dark. And of course, these layers of lights and darks don't have to be horizontal. They can be vertical, they can be at every angle. So why not find a drawing that you've done that you think is a little bit boring, perhaps a bit too much like this, and while we can't take the marks off, we can add marks to create stronger contrast in some areas and perhaps introduce enough distinctiveness in certain parts to create a more successful drawing. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. So why not try and revive an old drawing, inject a little more contrast in whatever way is still possible for you to do. But in the end, whatever you're drawing, however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.